there are bad PR disasters, and then there's whatever KSI has been going through over the last few weeks. Because this isn't just a situation where a creator makes one mistake and gets a little backlash. This has turned into something much bigger. We're talking about a chain of decisions that somehow kept making an already bad situation worse. And the craziest part, the thing that really pushed people over the edge wasn't the original announcement. It wasn't the criticism, it wasn't even the fallout that followed. It was the way KSI responded when the entire internet was already questioning him, a response that many fans saw as completely missing the point. But before we get to that, we need to go back to where all of this started, because the story didn't begin with a meme. It began with a goodbye. A goodbye that caught a lot of people by surprise. When KSI announced that he was leaving the Sidemen after more than a decade with the group, people expected it to be emotional. After all, this wasn't just another YouTube collaboration. The Sidemen had been a huge part of his identity for years. Millions of people grew up watching them together. So naturally, fans expected the departure to feel coordinated, respectful, and carefully planned. Instead, what happened felt rushed, almost chaotic. Not long after the announcement dropped, it became clear that some members of the Sidemen hadn't even been fully prepared for the timing. According to statements released afterward, the group themselves were caught off guard. They explained that they would have liked to give JJ a proper send-off and communicate everything together. But the video went live before those conversations had been finalized. And immediately, people started asking questions. Why did it happen that way? Why rush something this important? Why did it feel like everyone wasn't on the same page? Those questions only grew louder in the days that followed, because instead of the situation calming down, new details started appearing everywhere. Then came an article that poured gasoline on an already growing fire. An article suggesting that KSI had been pushed out, that he had been frozen out. That maybe the real story was very different from what people originally believed. And almost instantly, people began debating whether this was genuine information or a carefully crafted attempt to shift public opinion, because the timing felt strange, the messaging felt convenient, and the entire thing designed to push one specific narrative, a narrative where KSI was the victim, a narrative where the rest of the Sidemen were the problem. For many people reading it, the article didn't feel natural. It felt calculated, almost like someone had already decided exactly what they wanted the audience to think. And then came the line that made many readers stop in their tracks. The article emphasized that KSI had never publicly criticized the group, but that statement landed awkwardly, because people were reading an article that spent its entire time criticizing the group on his behalf. The contradiction was impossible to ignore, and once people noticed it, the internet did what the internet always does. They started clowning it. Memes appeared, posts exploded, comment sections filled up, and suddenly, instead of repairing his image, the situation seemed to be creating even more criticism. But somehow, the most controversial response was still yet to come, because while all of this was happening, another trend was becoming impossible to ignore. People started watching KSI's social numbers, follower counts, engagement, views, everything. And according to the trackers people were sharing online, the numbers weren't moving in the direction many expected. In fact, they appeared to be moving the opposite way. Fans were talking about unfollows, people were posting screenshots, others were comparing performance numbers, and every day, the conversation seemed to get louder. At this point, many expected KSI to directly address the criticism, maybe explain his side, maybe clear up the confusion, maybe release a statement. Instead, he posted a joke, and not just any joke, an elephant standing in an office, with a caption suggesting it would become his new profile picture. The message was obvious, the elephant in the room, a reference to the controversy everyone was talking about. Now, in another universe, maybe that joke works. Maybe people see it as self-awareness. Maybe they laugh. Maybe it helps break the tension. But timing is everything, and for a large portion of the audience, the timing couldn't have been worse, because many fans felt like major questions still hadn't been answered. And instead of getting answers, they got a meme. That's when the reactions really started pouring in, and some of them were brutal. Not because people disliked the joke itself, but because they felt it represented something bigger, a refusal to seriously engage with what had happened. And once Reddit got involved, things escalated fast. Reddit users wasted absolutely no time picking the situation apart. And if you've ever spent more than 5 minutes on the internet, you already know that's usually where things get ruthless. One post after another started gaining traction, not because they were defending KSI, but because they were questioning almost every move he had made since the announcement. Some fans argued that the problem wasn't him leaving the Sidemen. People leave groups all the time, people move on, people change priorities. That wasn't the issue. The issue, according to many viewers, was how everything unfolded afterward. The rushed goodbye, the mixed messaging, the articles, the social media posts, the cryptic responses, and then the elephant joke sitting right in the middle of it all. For a lot of people, it felt like every new response created a brand new controversy. And that's when one comment perfectly captured what many fans were thinking. Not because it was particularly complicated, but because it summarized weeks of drama in just a few sentences. The comment basically painted a picture of someone making one controversial move after another, only to end it all with a heart emoji, as if everything was suddenly okay. And the reason it spread so quickly was simple. People recognized the pattern. Even those who didn't fully agree with the criticism could understand why others were frustrated, because from the outside looking in, the situation seemed incredibly messy. But here's where the story takes an even more interesting turn. Because while everyone was focused on the current drama, some people started looking backward. And when they looked backward, they found something that made the entire situation feel strangely ironic. Years ago, KSI sat down and gave advice that many people actually respected. Advice about staying focused, advice about avoiding unnecessary public drama, advice about not becoming obsessed with numbers. At the time, it sounded reasonable. In fact, a lot of fans agreed with him. He talked about how constantly chasing statistics could become unhealthy, how creators should focus more on making content they enjoy, how numbers shouldn't control everything. And for years, those clips were used as examples of personal growth. But now people were comparing those old statements with what was happening today. And suddenly, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Because the same person who once said numbers shouldn't matter appeared to be paying very close attention to numbers. Subscriber counts, view counts, rankings, comparisons. The internet quickly noticed, and once people notice a contradiction online, they never stop talking about it. The criticism wasn't just about what he was doing, it was about what he had previously said. Because when your actions start moving in the opposite direction of your own advice, people begin asking uncomfortable questions. Was that growth genuine, or was it only convenient when the situation involved someone else? That question kept appearing over and over again. And unfortunately for KSI, the statistics weren't helping, because the more people looked at the numbers, the more ammunition critics felt they had. The creator who wanted to compete with some of the biggest names on the platform was now being compared directly against the people he had just left behind. And those comparisons weren't always flattering. View counts became discussion topics. Subscriber trends became discussion topics. Even ordinary social media posts became discussion topics. Every metric seemed to be analyzed. Every graph seemed to be shared. Every update seemed to become another headline. At that point, the story was no longer just about leaving a group. It had become a battle over perception. And perception can be far more damaging than reality. Because once enough people believe a narrative, every future action gets filtered through that lens. That's exactly what seemed to happen here. No matter what KSI posted, people interpreted it through the controversy. No matter what he said, people connected it back to the Sidemen situation. And then something else happened that made everything feel even more revealing. Because while KSI was facing criticism from strangers online, the reactions from people closest to him were surprisingly quiet, especially one person, Simon. Someone who had known JJ for years. Someone who had shared countless moments with him, both online and offline. Yet despite all the noise surrounding the situation, Simon barely said anything publicly. He acknowledged that the situation was real. He made it clear there was something happening behind the scenes. But beyond that, almost nothing. And sometimes silence speaks louder than words, especially when it comes from people who know the full story. That silence immediately caught people's attention because viewers expected arguments. They expected public back and forths. They expected drama. Instead, they got restraint. And strangely enough, that restraint ended up creating even more speculation because people started wondering what wasn't being said. And once that happens, curiosity becomes impossible to control. But Simon wasn't the only person whose reaction got attention, because soon another voice entered the conversation. And this time, it wasn't a fellow creator, it was family. And that added a completely different layer to the entire story. When family gets involved in internet drama, things almost always become more emotional. And that's exactly what happened here. As discussions about KSI continued spreading online, comments from his mother began attracting attention as well. From her perspective, it was understandable. She wasn't looking at the situation as a content creator. She wasn't looking at it as a fan. She was looking at it as a mother watching her son get criticized by millions of people. And naturally, she wanted to defend him. But those comments ended up creating another debate entirely, because some people sympathized with her. Others felt the situation was becoming even more complicated. And suddenly, what started as a conversation about leaving the Sidemen had transformed into something much bigger. Now people weren't just discussing the departure, they were discussing friendships, public image, motives, reputation, and everything in between. But here's where things became difficult for many fans to ignore. For years, KSI built an image around confidence, around roasting people, around public rivalries, around saying exactly what was on his mind. That personality helped make him one of the biggest creators on the platform. It became part of his brand, part of his identity, which is why some viewers struggled with the idea that he was now being presented as someone deeply hurt by jokes and online criticism. To them, the two images didn't seem to fit together, and that disconnect only fueled more discussion. Because whether people supported KSI or not, almost everyone agreed on one thing. The narrative had become confusing, and confusion is dangerous online. The moment audiences stop understanding what's happening, they start creating their own explanations. Some fair, some unfair, some completely wrong. But once those narratives take hold, they spread incredibly fast. And while all of this was happening, another moment quietly added fuel to the fire. A moment involving Toby, someone many fans viewed as one of the calmest and most reasonable voices in the group. Early on, Toby appeared willing to give KSI the benefit of the doubt. He explained that leaving was a personal decision. He explained that everyone had different priorities. He explained that managing 7 people's schedules wasn't easy. In other words, he tried to lower the temperature, he tried to reduce the drama, he tried to keep things balanced. And for a while, many people respected him for that. Then came an awkward moment nobody expected. While live in front of his audience, Toby realized he had been removed from one of KSI's videos. The reaction wasn't explosive. There was no screaming, no public meltdown, just confusion, genuine confusion. The kind that feels far more uncomfortable because it's real. And almost instantly, clips of that moment started circulating. Not because it was shocking, but because it felt symbolic. Another small detail that seemed to reinforce the idea that relationships behind the scenes weren't as smooth as people hoped. Then came another moment that many viewers found difficult to ignore. Motivational messages, quotes about growth, quotes about leaving comfort zones, quotes about self-improvement. Normally, those kinds of messages would go completely unnoticed. But context changes everything, because when you're in the middle of a controversy, people don't judge your words in isolation. They compare them to your actions, and that's exactly what happened. Suddenly, every quote became a discussion, every message became a debate, every post became evidence for one side or the other. And by this point, the situation had reached a strange stage. The original announcement wasn't the main story anymore. The response had become the story. Think about that for a second. The decision to leave the Sidemen created headlines, but the reaction to the backlash created an even bigger conversation. And that's usually a sign that something has gone wrong. Because when the explanation generates more criticism than the event itself, people start paying attention for different reasons. They're no longer waiting for answers, they're waiting for the next mistake. And that's exactly where KSI seemed to find himself. Every move was being watched, every statement was being analyzed, every post was being interpreted. Fairly or unfairly, that's where the situation had ended up. Now, does that mean every criticism is justified? Not necessarily. Does it mean every rumor is true? Of course not. Internet drama rarely operates in absolutes, but perception matters. And right now, perception appears to be the biggest challenge KSI is facing. Because underneath all the memes, all the tweets, all the articles, and all the arguments, one question continues to follow this entire story. If KSI already knew the right way to handle public conflict, why did he choose a different path when it was finally his turn? And that's the question many fans still haven't answered. Maybe more information comes out, maybe perspectives change. Maybe time cools everything down. But for now, one thing seems clear. What could have been remembered as a simple farewell has evolved into one of the most talked about controversies surrounding KSI in recent years. And whether you're on his side or not, it's hard to deny one thing. The response became bigger than the original story. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think KSI handled this situation the wrong way, or do you think the internet completely overreacted? Let me know down in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure you check out the next one on your screen. Trust me, you won't want to miss it.